The sound was not of war, but of a heavy iron bolt being drawn back. It echoed in the concrete silence of the Lubyanka's inner corridors. Major Viktor Semyonov did not blink as the door to his temporary cell swung open. For 3 days and nights he had been here, not as an interrogator for the first time in his career, but as a resident. The accusations were a blur of bureaucratic venom. Operational overreach at Smolensk, unnecessary losses. They were a pretext. He had made enemies in high places with his ruthless efficiency. His world, built on absolute loyalty and cold precision, had crumbled into this. 4 walls, a cot, and the terrifying uncertainty of a man who knew too much about the system's machinery to believe in its mercy. The guard did not speak, merely gestured. Semyonov rose, his uniform tunic creased, the starch of his authority gone. He was led not to an execution basement, but up, through sterile administrative floors, to an office that smelled of polish, old leather, and expensive Turkish tobacco. General Volkov, a man whose face was a topographic map of the Eastern Front, sat behind a desk. He did not look up from a dossier. Laid beside it, like a morbid paperweight, was a standard-issue TT pistol. Semyonov stood, his spine rod straight, his mind calculating angles of attack, distances to the window, the futility of it all. This was where it ended. A summary judgment, a quiet report filed, his body unclaimed in a communal pit. Volkov finally closed the folder. He picked up the pistol. His eyes, the color of winter slate, held not anger, but a terrifying, clinical assessment. He did not point the weapon. Instead, with a slow, deliberate turn of his wrist, he slid it across the polished oak until it stopped an inch from Semyonov's belt buckle. "There are 2 ways this ends today, Major." Volkov's voice was a dry whisper, yet it filled the room. "One is simple. It requires a single action from you. A final service to the state, acknowledging your failures. Clean. Efficient." Semyonov's blood turned to ice. His eyes remained fixed on a point above Volkov's head. He had seen this play out for others. He had never imagined the cold weight of the offer on his own skin. "The other way," Volkov continued, opening a second, thicker dossier, "is an act of near-certain suicide with a marginally higher chance of failure. But a chance nonetheless." He flipped the dossier around. Aerial photographs of empty, sun-drenched fields near Kursk. Schematics not of tanks, but of wooden frames and canvas shells. A requisition list for paint, lumber, and inflatable rubber. It was a document of pure madness. "Your new command, should you be foolish enough to choose it," Volkov said, tapping a pale finger on a map. "The 5th Guards Tank Army. 800 tanks. 2 artillery regiments. Support columns. It does not exist. You will invent it. From sticks and glue and shadows, you have 14 days. The goal is to convince the German High Command that this phantom is the tip of our spear, poised to strike their flank. You must pull at least 2 of their panzer divisions toward this emptiness." Semyonov's composure cracked, a faint, incredulous twitch at the corner of his mouth. "This is a theatrical production, Comrade General, not a military operation." "It is both," Volkov snapped, the calm evaporating. "And it is the only door out of this room that does not lead to a wall. Your specialist is waiting downstairs, a set designer from the Moscow Art Theater, Alexei Krylov. He is a prisoner of conscience. His art is his crime. His skill is your only weapon. He knows how to make lies look real from 2,000 meters. You know how to make those lies survive for 72 critical hours. If you succeed, the Smolensk file disappears. You will be a hero of the Soviet Union. If you fail, Volkov's gaze flicked to the pistol. The failure will be so catastrophic, so damaging to the coming offensive, that a bullet will be a mercy they will not grant you. You will spend the rest of your very short life in a hole, knowing your arrogance doomed 500,000 men. Do you understand the balance now, Major? It is not just your life, it is your eternity. The scale of the insanity crashed over Semyonov. It was a trap more elaborate and cruel than any interrogation. To die now was simple. To accept this was to agree to build a castle on a cloud, with the fate of the war resting on its illusion. The pistol gleamed dully under the lamp, a promise of an end, a clean end. He saw the fields in the photograph, the utter defenseless nothingness. He saw the face of the unknown artist, another doomed man, and a terrible stubborn fury ignited in his gut. A rage not at Volkov, but at the elegant cruelty of the choice. They were not just asking him to die. They were asking him to become a clown, a fabricator of toys, before his inevitable execution. The insult of it burned hotter than the fear. His hand did not move toward the pistol. It remained at his side, clenched into a white-knuckled fist. "Where?" he heard his own voice say, rough with 3 days of silence. "Do I collect my army of carpenters?" A ghost of something, not a smile, but a recognition of a particular kind of damned stubbornness, passed over Volkov's face. He slid the dossier fully toward Semyonov. "The jeep is outside. You go directly to the airfield. Your materials and your consultant will meet you at the location. You do not return to Moscow without the order of Lenin or in a zinc coffin. The decision is made. Go, create a ghost." The flight in the rattling Li-2 transport plane was a roar of noise and vibration. Semyonov sat strapped to the cold fuselage, the dossier on his knees. He stared at the schematics for a false Tiger tank, a ridiculous, flat silhouette. The humiliation was a live wire in his chest. He was a master of intelligence, of counter-espionage, of real violence. Now he was a puppet master of plywood and deceit. They landed on a rough grass strip near a sparse birch forest. The front was a distant, dull thunder on the horizon. Here, there was only the oppressive silence of the Russian summer, the buzz of insects, the smell of earth and pollen. A truck was waiting, and beside it, under the guard of a stone-faced NKVD sergeant, stood a man who looked like a scarecrow, blown in from a different storm. Alexei Krylov was wraith-thin, drowning in a shabby civilian coat. He clutched a small, battered suitcase to his chest, like a life-preserver. His eyes, magnified by round spectacles, darted across the landscape with an artist's desperate search for composition, finding only terrifying, endless scale. Semyonov approached. The two men examined each other. The soldier, his authority stripped and replaced with a monstrous, impossible mandate. His uniform, a lie. The artist, a prisoner of imagination, thrust into a drama, where a bad review meant a firing squad. Krylov gave a slight shaky nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared damnation. Semyonov did not return the greeting. He turned from the artist and looked out at the field that stretched to the tree line. The sun beat down on the empty grassland. The task was no longer words in a dossier. It was this vast, silent, mocking emptiness. He had to fill it with an army that could bend the strategy of the Wehrmacht. He had to make the air itself seem heavy with the threat of steel. He felt the phantom weight of the pistol still in his belt. He felt the eyes of the artist, wide with fear, on his back. He felt the eyes of General Volkov, watching from 1,000 kilometers away. And he felt the crushing weight of the millions of men who would live or die based on the quality of the lie he and this trembling scarecrow would now stitch together from canvas and fear. The stage was set. There were no actors, no script, no props. Only 2 condemned men and a field waiting to swallow them whole. The first move in the duel was not theirs to make. The enemy was time and reality, and it was already winning. The first night was a descent into a new kind of chaos. Semyonov established his headquarters not in a village, but in a damp, mosquito-infested dugout, carved into the side of a ravine, hidden by a thicket of young pines. Maps were pinned to raw earth walls with bayonets. The only light came from a single kerosene lamp, its flickering glow casting monstrous, dancing shadows that felt more real than the operation itself. Here, the grand, strategic insanity of Moscow met the gritty, pathetic reality of execution. Krylov was given a corner, his suitcase open to reveal not clothes but charcoal sticks, rolls of drafting paper, pots of dried paint, and a set of calipers. He worked with a frantic, silent energy, his earlier tremors replaced by a focused desperation. By dawn, he presented Semyonov not with military plans, but with a series of theatrical elevations and blueprints. They were beautiful, detailed, and utterly alien to a soldier's eye. The perspective is everything from 500 meters and above, Krylov explained, his voice gaining a sliver of strength when discussing his craft. He pointed with a charcoal-blackened finger. We do not build tanks. We build impressions of tanks. A wooden skeleton, skinned with painted canvas. The turret is a faceted box, the gun barrel a stovepipe. Shadows are painted on. From the air, in morning or evening light, the depth will be convincing. For tracks, we use a real tractor. 1 pass, 2 deep grooves. Then we replicate the pattern with wooden stamps, like a giant child playing in mud. Semyonov listened, a stone sinking in his gut. It sounded like a school play. Yet, within the absurdity, he began to detect a cold, perverse logic. It was not about fooling a soldier on the ground. It was about fooling a camera lens, a hurried pilot's glance, a German analyst comparing shadows on a grainy photograph. He gave the orders. They were the strangest of his career. A column of trucks arrived, not with ammunition, but with raw lumber, rolls of coarse canvas, barrels of dark paint, miles of rope, and bundles of inflatable rubber bladders normally used for river crossings. The second wave brought the people, 24 weary, confused carpenters and painters mobilized from collective farms, a platoon of sullen sappers who saw this as an insult to their combat engineering skills, and a signals detachment with strict orders to broadcast the most convincing silence filled with meaningless noise. And then there was Captain Igor Yermolov and his battalion. They arrived at dusk, the 10 real T-34s growling into a hidden clearing, their diesel engines chugging like beasts of burden. Yermolov was young, with the crisp assurance of a frontline commander who had faced real steel and fire. He saluted Semyonov sharply, then scanned the area, his brow furrowing. "Where is the assembly point for the division, Comrade Major? My crews are ready to integrate." Semyonov met his gaze, seeing the eager professional pride there. Crushing it was his first duty. "There is no division, Captain. Your 10 tanks are the entire armored fist of the 5th Guards. Your mission is not to integrate, it is to impersonate. He laid out the plan. Yermolov's face went from confusion to disbelief, then to a flush of humiliated anger. You want my combat vehicles to act as props? To drive in circles at night to make dust? This is for the stage, not for war. The rage in the young captain's voice mirrored the fury Semyonov had swallowed in Volkov's office. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the chill of the Lubyanka cell. Your alternative, Captain, is to explain to the tribunal why you refused an order that holds the balance of the Kursk salient in its hands. Your tanks will be the only real things in this phantom army. That makes you the most important soldier here, or the most disposable. Choose now. The confrontation hung in the air, a microcosm of the entire operation, the clash between the brutal, straightforward reality of war and the delicate, maddening craft of illusion. Yermolov's jaw clenched. He looked at his machines, then at the piles of lumber, then back at Semyonov's implacable eyes. He gave a stiff, defeated nod. The rebellion was extinguished, replaced by a bitter, simmering obedience. Work began with a surreal fervor. The field transformed into a grotesque open-air workshop. The carpenters, initially clumsy, were guided by Krylov's surprisingly firm hands. He was no longer a frightened prisoner here. He was a master craftsman in his element, measuring, correcting, showing how a diagonal brace sold the weight of a non-existent turret. Under his direction, skeletal T-34s and heavier KV tanks began to rise from the grass. They were fragile, skeletal things up close, trembling in the wind. The painters followed, using brooms and rags to stain the canvas with greens, browns, and black. Krylov insisted on mixing dirt into the paint. The dust must be part of the skin, not on it, he muttered, his glasses speckled with color. He showed them how to dry brush highlights and, most bizarrely, how to paint perfect, convincing shadows on the lower edges of the fake vehicles, shadows that would remain static and correct as the sun moved, locking the illusion for the brief moment a reconnaissance plane might pass. Semyonov moved through the site like a vengeful ghost. His anger, born in Volkov's office, found its outlet in relentless, unforgiving pressure. He checked the alignment of the dummy tanks from the predicted angles of aerial approach. He measured the spacing between them, ensuring it mirrored authentic deployment doctrine. He had the sappers dig fake artillery emplacements, shallow pits that from above looked like prepared firing positions. The inflatable rubber guns, when pumped up, looked laughable, but when covered with a painted canvas sheet and positioned at the edge of a shadow, they gained a chilling plausibility. At night, Yermolov's real tanks went to work. Their engines would roar to life in the darkness. They would not drive in formation, but in a careful, orchestrated chaos. One would make a looping track deep into a field, then retreat. Another would drag weighted bundles of branches to churn dust on a different road. They used precious fuel to create the fossil record of an army's movement, a network of fresh, intersecting tracks leading to the dummy parking areas, where the ground was meticulously churned by soldiers' boots to simulate disembarkation. Semyonov would stand on a small hillock, watching the red taillights of the T-34s weave in the darkness, like fireflies spelling out a gigantic, deceptive message to the heavens. The sound of their engines was the only real weapon he had. He listened to it, judging its volume, its dispersion. Was it the sound of 10 tanks or 100? In the vastness of the night, with echoes rolling across the plains, it was impossibly hard to tell. That was the point. This entire endeavor was an exercise in abusing perception, in weaponizing doubt. Krylov approached him one such night, his face pale in the gloom. He pointed to a half-finished dummy, a skeletal monstrosity against the starry sky. "It feels like building our own graves, Major. Each one we finish, it's like hammering another nail into the coffin if they see through it." Semyonov did not look at him. He kept his eyes on the dancing lights below. "Then make sure the nails are perfect, artist." A crooked nail is the first thing an undertaker notices. He paused, the shared absurdity hanging between them. "We are not building our graves. We are building a theater. And the only ticket for admission is a panzer division. We must make the show irresistible." He walked away, leaving Krylov in the dark. The second chapter of their ordeal was written not in victories, but in sawdust and painted shadows, in the rumble of engines on an empty stage, and in the silent growing dread that this intricate house of cards was one gust of wind, one curious enemy scout, away from collapsing and burying them all in its ridiculous ruin. The ghost was taking shape, a pale, fragile giant born of desperation and saws. And it demanded to be fed not with fuel, but with the absolute belief of its creators, a belief that was fraying faster than the cheap canvas in the summer sun. A new, surreal routine solidified like cold cement. The phantom army grew, not with the roar of industry, but with the whispered conspiracy of 100 men committing the same perfect crime against reality. Each dawn, Semyonov would walk the lines of his fabricated force. Up close, it was a carnival of absurdities. The smell of fresh pine and drying paint, the flutter of canvas in the wind, the hollow knock of a fist on a turret that promised only splinters. It was an army of empty coffins waiting for a war that would never come to them. But from the edge of the tree line, squinting against the rising sun, the illusion coagulated. The painted shadows worked. The careful spacing imposed a grim order. The fake tracks, artfully aged with scattered dirt and shallow puddles of stale water, told a story of recent, heavy movement. It was a painting in 3 dimensions, and its genius was in its deliberate, calculated imperfection. Krylov had ordered a few dummies to be slightly misaligned, a canvas tarp to be half removed, as if maintenance was ongoing. "Perfection is suspicious," he'd insisted, his artist's eye now fully commandeered by the military deception. "An army is messy. It leaves trash. It is tired." So they scattered real trash, empty fuel cans, mostly water, broken crates, remnants of field kitchens, around the fake camps. The heart of the deception, however, beat not in the static displays, but in the dark. Captain Yermolov's tank battalion became a spectral orchestra, and Semyonov was its relentless, unforgiving conductor. Every night was a performance. The 10 T-34s were divided into 2 roaming groups. Their movements were plotted on a map, not with tactical arrows, but with the fluid, overlapping lines of a choreographer's diagram. One group would throttle their engines at the northern edge of the deception zone, creating a deep, rumbling fanfare that rolled for kilometers. They would then move at slow speed, dragging chains and weighted tarps, churning a thick, moonlit plume of dust visible for miles. Simultaneously, the second group would begin a separate maneuver to the south, using their headlights for brief, illegal flashes, simulating the careless marker lights of a larger, confident force moving behind the lines. Yermolov, his initial resentment hardening into a brittle professional obsession, pushed his crews and machines to the limit. A tank is not designed for this. The engines overheated from constant low gear, high RPM maneuvering. Tracks, meant for battlefields, wore down on the dry, unforgiving soil. The mechanics worked through the night, cursing not the enemy, but the absurdity of destroying their own vehicles for a pantomime. Semyonov's most critical weapon was the radio. The signals detachment, under his meticulous direction, began broadcasting life. It was a masterpiece of banal secrecy. They used real Soviet military frequencies and call signs, but the traffic was a carefully scripted farce. Operators, reading from coded scripts, transmitted messages about regimental logistics delays, divisional commander's inspection, and complaints about fuel quality for the 3rd Battalion. The messages were just clumsy enough, just specific enough to be utterly convincing. They never mentioned the fake 5th Army by name, but its presence was woven into every mundane exchange. And then, for hours, there would be strict radio silence, the kind observed before a major movement. The psychological toll became a tangible third presence, thicker than the dust. The carpenters and painters, initially bemused, grew nervous. They were building targets, not tools. Every distant drone of an aircraft, a crow, a civilian plane, their own, made them flinch and scatter for the tree line. A superstitious dread settled over the sight. The men began to whisper about the dummy soldiers, attributing bad luck to certain tanks, avoiding them in the dark. Krylov was transforming, his body thinning further, but his eyes burning with a fanatic's light. He saw flaws invisible to anyone else, a shadow painted at the wrong angle, a dummy that looked too symmetrical. He would order it, repainted, rebuilt, even as Semyonov growled about time. The artist was no longer just saving his life. He was defending the integrity of the illusion, the truth of the lie. It was his magnum opus, and he knew the critics carried bombs. The tension between Semyonov and Yermolov reached a breaking point. The captain confronted Semyonov one morning after another night of grinding mechanical torture. One of his T-34s had thrown a track, crippled by the charade. "This is unsustainable, Comrade Major. I am losing machines not to the Germans, but to this theater. When the real battle comes, my battalion will be a footnote, unfit for combat." Semyonov faced him, the shared exhaustion a bridge between their ranks. "You are wrong, Captain," he said, his voice flat. "Your battalion is already engaged in the most critical battle. You are not wearing down tracks. You are grinding down the judgment of German intelligence officers. Every kilometer you fake, every hour of engine noise you donate, is a kilometer, and an hour, a real panzer division, will not be facing our real troops at Kursk. Your machines are expendable. The illusion is not. If I have to order you to burn out every engine until they are silent, smoking husks, I will do it. Your tanks are no longer weapons of steel. They are instruments of perception. Start playing them like a symphony, or I will find a new conductor." That night, during the maneuvers, Semyonov climbed to his highest observation point. He looked down at the spectacle, the roaming pinpricks of light, the distant echoed growl of diesels, the vast, silent sea of dummies below, waiting in the moonlight. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, he saw it not as a desperate scheme, but as it might appear to a German observer, the unmistakable, sprawling, dormant evidence of a massive armored fist, gathering its strength. The ghost had developed a heartbeat, a rhythmic, manufactured pulse of light and sound. It had a psychology, a pattern, a scent of diesel and disorder. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The deception was no longer just a plan on paper or dummies in a field. It had taken on a life of its own. It was a living, breathing entity, and they were its nervous system. And like any living thing, it now craved one thing to survive: to be believed. The trap was set. The bait was elaborately, painstakingly placed. All that remained was for the enemy to take the first, fatal step into their theater of shadows. But the wait was its own kind of torture, stretching every nerve, every moment of silence into a screaming question. The Ghost Army was ready. Now, it needed an audience. The tension that followed the completion of the Phantom Army was worse than the frantic labor of building it. It was a silent, screaming vacuum. The men moved through the dummy ranks like ghosts themselves, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes perpetually scanning the empty, immense blue of the summer sky. Every distant hum was a threat. Every cloud was a potential reconnaissance plane. The illusion was complete, and now it sat there, a vast, elaborate question mark etched into the earth, waiting for an answer. Semyonov's command dugout became a nerve center of taut silence. He enforced a brutal discipline on the radio operators. The carefully scripted, banal transmissions continued, but now with longer pauses, hints of suppressed urgency, the calm before a storm. He ordered the maintenance on the dummies to increase. Small groups of men, visibly from a distance, would be seen working on tank engines or adjusting tarp covers during the day, only to vanish at dusk, leaving the machines seemingly ready. Krylov's obsession entered a new, microscopic phase. He walked the lines at different times of day, a sketchbook in hand, noting how the shadows shifted. He ordered subtle adjustments. A dummy moved 3 meters to the west to catch a more convincing afternoon shadow. A painted track was softened where it entered the tree line, as if obscured by passing traffic. He lived in mortal terror of a single wrong detail, a shadow pointing the wrong way, a color too vibrant, that would unravel everything. He no longer saw wood and canvas. He saw the photograph it would become in a German intelligence briefing. He was no longer painting tanks. He was painting truth for the enemy's eye. The first sign was not a sound, but an absence. The normal bird song from the eastern edge of the field died abruptly one afternoon. A sentry, a young sapper with preternaturally sharp ears, reported it. Semyonov felt the cold finger of fate trace his spine. He gave a series of swift, quiet orders. All visible movement in the dummy area ceased. The men melted into the forests and trenches, becoming part of the landscape. Only the illusion remained, exposed and vulnerable under the relentless sun. Then came the drone. A high, thin, mosquito-like whine, barely audible at first, then solidifying into a distinct, mechanical thrum from the west. It was not heading directly for them. It was making a lazy, sweeping arc, a predator circling its territory. From his concealed observation post, Semyonov raised his binoculars. His knuckles were white. There it was, a sleek, dark speck against the azure, sunlight glinting off its canopy. A Focke-Wulf FW-189, the flying eye of the Wehrmacht. Its twin-boomed frame was unmistakable. It flew with an arrogant, leisurely precision, a chess master, surveying the board. The plane banked, its course adjusting subtly. It was coming for a pass. Semyonov's heart hammered against his ribs, a violent, animal drum. This was the first critic, the only critic that mattered. He whispered a single harsh command down the field telephone line. Stand by. All positions. Absolute stillness. An unnatural frozen silence descended upon the fake army. 200 men held their breath, In his dugout, Krylov closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in a painter's terrible visualization. He saw the plane's camera shutter click, freezing his creation in monochrome grain. He mentally traced every line, every shadow, every calculated imperfection. It was out of his hands now. The artwork was being judged. The FW-189 passed directly overhead, its shadow a fleeting crucifix sweeping across the fields of fake tanks. The drone of its engines vibrated in their teeth. They could see the dark lenses of the cameras pointed down. It made one pass, then banked again, wider, coming back for a second, lower run from a different angle. This was standard reconnaissance procedure, mapping the deception from multiple axes. Semyonov's mind raced, analyzing the angles. The sun was behind the plane on the second pass, perfect for highlighting the painted shadows. Krylov had planned for this. The plane completed its second run, then, with a casual increase in engine pitch, climbed and turned west, back toward its own lines. The drone faded, swallowed by the vastness of the sky. The silence it left behind was deafening, thick with spent adrenaline and dread. No one moved for a full 5 minutes. Then slowly, like mice emerging after a cat has passed, the men returned to their positions. There was no celebration. They had not been bombed. That was the only victory. Hours later, in a well-lit map room 100 kilometers to the west, the critic delivered its verdict. The aerial photographs, still smelling of developing chemicals, were laid out on a large table under the glare of halogen lamps. Oberst Ludwig von Bruck, an intelligence analyst of the old Prussian school with a face like a tired hawk, leaned over them. His finger, adorned with a simple signet ring, moved slowly across the glossy surfaces. He pointed to the neat rows of dark, rectangular shapes. T-34s. Here and here. A battalion at least, possibly a regiment in dispersal. He moved to another photo, taken from the sunward angle. See the shadows? Consistent. The spacing is textbook Soviet. Here, evidence of track activity. Fresh. And here, the logistics area. Trucks, tents, field kitchens. He nodded, almost to himself. It is a build-up. A significant one. A younger major, eager, leaned in. Then the reports are correct. A reserve army is forming there. We must alert High Command. Von Bruck did not straighten up. His eyes, pale and cold, remained fixed on the photographs. He saw the tanks, the tracks, the shadows. It was all there. And yet, he had studied the Soviet mind for 20 years. There was a pattern, a rhythm to their deployments. This one felt staged. It is too textbook, he murmured, his voice a low rumble. The spacing is perfect. The shadows are perfectly consistent.
It is as if they want us to see an army. He tapped a cluster of shapes at the edge of the tree line. And these here. The camouflage nets are placed with an artist's care. Soviet frontline troops are many things. They are not artists. His doubt hung in the smoke-filled room, a discordant note against the clear evidence. I do not trust a painting that is too clean, he said finally, straightening his aching back. Order a ground-level verification. Send a team from Brandenburger Regiment. I want eyes on the ground. I want to know if those shadows are cast by steel or by wood. The decision was made. The illusion had passed the first, crucial test. It had been seen, and it had been believed enough to warrant deeper investigation. But it had also, in its very perfection, sown the seed of suspicion in a meticulous mind. The ghost had been spotted. Now it would be touched. The most dangerous phase was beginning. The audience was no longer just looking from a safe distance. They were stepping onto the stage, and they intended to knock on the scenery. Semyonov's breathless vigil was over. The duel was now active, and the next move would be in the dark, close enough to smell the enemy's sweat and hear the rustle of his uniform against the grass. The margin for error had just evaporated. The news of the reconnaissance flight did not bring relief, only a sharper, more focused kind of dread. They had been seen, but not yet seen through. Semyonov understood the next logical step in the enemy's calculus, as if he were reading their operational manual. Aerial photography demanded ground truth. The period of waiting was over. Now they were hunters waiting in a trap of their own making, unsure if the prey would sniff it out or spring it. He transformed the operation overnight. The comforting, if absurd, routine of building and maintaining the dummies was replaced by the silent, lethal protocols of an ambush. The carpenters and painters were confined to a deep, camouflaged bunker, their tools replaced by a nervous, shared silence. The radio chatter became even more deliberate, a delicate performance designed to sound normal to any listening posts, while hinting at nothing of the heightened alert. Semyonov's most trusted men, a dozen hardened NKVD border guards, and a few of Yermolov's most ruthless tank crewmen, stripped of their vehicles and armed with knives, suppressed pistols, and entrenching tools, were deployed in a wide, silent perimeter. They were not there to fight a battle. They were there to erase one. Their orders were absolute. No gunfire, no shouts, no traces. Any intruder was to disappear without a whisper, as if swallowed by the earth itself. Krylov was a wreck. The intellectual challenge of fooling a camera had been replaced by the visceral terror of fooling a man at 10 paces. He couldn't sleep. He imagined German fingers tracing the grain of his plywood, tugging at his canvas, feeling the hollow mockery of his genius. His creation, his beautiful, terrible lie, was about to be subjected to the most intimate of inspections. Semyonov found him in the dugout, staring at his charcoal sketches as if they were sacred texts that had failed him. "They will touch them," Krylov whispered, not looking up. "They will feel the truth." Semyonov's response was brutal in its simplicity. Then they must not live to report what their fingers tell them. The night the German team arrived was moonless, perfect for infiltration. A soft, damp wind rustled the leaves, masking sound. Semyonov was at his forward post, a shallow scrape in the earth at the edge of the forest, overlooking a cluster of his most convincing dummy KV-1 tanks. His senses were hyper-alert, every shadow a potential enemy, every rustle a potential threat. He could smell the pine, the damp soil, and his own cold sweat. They came like ghosts, materializing from the darkness. 3 figures, clad in mottled camouflage smocks, moving with a slow, predatory grace that spoke of elite training. Brandenburger. Commandos who spoke fluent Russian, who moved behind lines like poison. They paused at the tree line, observing the silent field of shapes. One raised a pair of night glasses, scanning slowly. Semyonov stopped breathing. He was less than 30 meters from them. The leader gave a hand signal. 2 men melted away to flank the position, covering approaches. The leader himself, a compact, agile figure, moved forward toward the nearest dummy tank. This was the moment. The intellectual chess game had collapsed into this. A man in the dark, about to lay his hand on a painted piece of cloth.
Semyonov slithered from his position, a shadow among shadows. His world contracted to the space between him and the commando. The wind, the distant front, the fate of Kursk, all faded. There was only the soft crunch of a boot on gravel ahead of him. He moved with a lifetime of ingrained stealth, the cold weight of his pistol a familiar comfort in his palm. But he dared not use it. The sound would carry. It would be the death knell for the operation. The German reached the dummy. He stood there for a long moment, a silhouette against the slightly lighter sky. Then he reached out. His hand did not touch the painted canvas of the hull. Instead, it went to the track. He knelt, feeling the deep, hard-edged groove in the earth, the real tractor work. He grunted, a soft sound of satisfaction. It was convincing. But then his hand moved up, brushing against the lower edge of the dummy's side. His fingers traced the seam where the canvas was stapled to the wooden frame. He paused. He tapped. A soft, hollow thud echoed in the still night, unmistakably the sound of wood, not the dense clang of armor plate. Semyonov saw the man's body tense, the sudden, electric realization. The commando began to turn, his hand dropping to the submachine gun slung across his chest. He was going to signal his men. He was going to withdraw with the truth. There was no time for thought. Semyonov erupted from the darkness. It was not an attack. It was a collision. He slammed into the German, driving him hard against the wooden skeleton of the dummy tank. The structure shuddered with a sound that seemed catastrophically loud. A stifled gasp of air was punched from the commando's lungs. Semyonov's left hand clamped over the man's mouth, his fingers digging into the jaw with crushing force. His right hand brought the heavy, lead-weighted sap down in a short, vicious arc onto the man's temple. There was a sickening, wet crunch. The body went limp. But the sound of the impact against the dummy had been a betrayal. A sharp, guttural challenge in German came from the flank. One of the other commandos had heard. A beam of a flashlight, shielded by fingers, swept across the ground. Semyonov dropped the body and melted back into the blackness, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He heard movement, not the careful stealth of before, but the urgent, crashing steps of men knowing they were compromised. A low whistle, a signal to withdraw. From the other side of the position, there was a brief, muffled struggle. A choked cry cut brutally short, the sound of a heavy weight hitting the ground. Then silence. Semyonov's men were doing their work. But the third commando was fleeing, crashing through the undergrowth back toward his lines, the most valuable piece of intelligence alive and moving. Semyonov gave chase, a silent, desperate phantom. He could hear the man's panicked breath ahead. He pushed himself, branches whipping at his face. He gained. He was feet away when the German burst into a small clearing. The man spun, bringing his weapon up. Semyonov saw the pale oval of his face in the starlight, saw the muzzle beginning to rise. He never heard the shot. It was the snap of a wire, the release of tension. One of the sappers, following Semyonov's contingency orders, had rigged the likely escape routes with simple, brutal snares. A loop of piano wire, anchored to a sapling, whipped up from the leaf litter. It caught the commando's ankle. With a yelp of pain and surprise, he was jerked off his feet, crashing to the ground, his weapon flying from his grasp. Semyonov was on him before he could draw a knife. It was over in seconds. A precise final stroke with his own blade. Then utter, profound silence, broken only by his ragged breathing and the returning whisper of the wind. He stood there, in the dark, the blood on his hands still warm. The inspection was over. The truth had been felt, but it had died with the men who discovered it. They had passed the second test, but at a cost. The operation was no longer a clean intellectual deception. It was now stained with the intimate, close-quarters violence of murder. The Ghost Army had demanded its first blood sacrifice, not from the enemy, but in its own defense, from those who came too close to its hollow heart. They had survived by seconds, by a length of piano wire, and a brutal swing of a sap. The margin was gone. They were dancing on a razor's edge, and the first cut was theirs. The silence that returned was not peaceful. It was the silence of a stage after a killing, waiting for the next act, drenched in the knowledge that the audience was now suspicious and angry. The victory was Pyrrhic and tasted of copper and dirt. The 3 German bodies were buried deep in unmarked forest graves, their equipment stripped and carefully burned. The ground around the dummy tank where the struggle occurred was meticulously swept. The canvas side panel where the commando's fingers had brushed, re-stretched and repainted by a trembling pale Krylov under the first gray light of dawn. The operation had to look untouched, as if the night had passed in perfect, silent tranquility. But the men were changed. They had crossed a line. They were no longer just builders of a lie. They were its guardians, its murderers. The air in the camp grew thick with a superstitious dread. Oberst von Bruck, in his map room to the west, received no report from his Brandenburger team. Radio silence after such a mission was not unusual for a few hours. But by noon, a cold certainty settled in his gut. The silence was not procedural. It was absolute. His team, some of the best he had vanished without a trace into that quiet patch of forest and field. That, in itself, was a report. Only something of immense value or immense deception was guarded so lethally. His suspicion hardened from a vague unease into a focused, professional conviction. The picture was too clean. The silence was too complete. It stank of a mask. He issued new orders, not for more subtle probes, but for a definitive brutal test. If this was a real army, it would react like one. If it was a theater set, it would collapse under fire. He requested, and received, authorization for a limited artillery strike. A probing action. A single battery of 150mm howitzers would target the northeastern edge of the suspected deployment area, a cluster of tanks and logistics points identified in the photos. The calculus was cold. If it was real, they would hit steel, cause secondary explosions, and trigger a panicked response. If it was fake, they would hit wood and canvas, and the silence that followed would be of a different, more revealing kind. The warning came to Semyonov through the distant, fragile threads of partisan intelligence and Soviet listening posts. A fragmentary coded message: expect calibration fire, sector gamma, dawn. It was not much, but it was everything. They had roughly 12 hours. Semyonov gathered his core team in the suffocating dark of the command dugout. The faces around the map were gaunt, etched with exhaustion and the fresh memory of the night's killings. Yermolov, his young captain's bravado now sanded down to a grim, hardened core. Krylov, looking spectral, his hands stained with paint that looked like dried blood in the lamplight. Semilya laid it out, his voice a flat, emotionless instrument. The Germans were not sending men anymore. They were sending high explosives, They needed to see a reaction. The destruction of dummies alone would be inconclusive. Rubble could hide the truth. To sell the lie, to make the enemy believe they had hit a real sensitive target, there needed to be a real catastrophic response. Fire, secondary explosions, the unmistakable signature of armored vehicles dying. Yermolov understood first. His face, already pale, went ashen. You want to put real tanks in the impact zone. Not just tanks, Semyonov corrected, his eyes like chips of flint. Fuel trucks, ammunition, a real high-value target. We need to give their observers a show. We need to burn something real. The silence that followed was heavier than any before. It was the sound of a moral abyss opening up. They were discussing sacrificing their own men, their own irreplaceable real hardware, to protect the fiction. It was the ultimate perversion of command. Yermolov exploded, a contained, furious eruption. Those are my men, my machines. They are for fighting the enemy, not for burning in a propaganda display. You are asking me to execute them for a lie. Semyonov did not flinch. I am asking you to choose which men and which machines will give the greatest meaning to their sacrifice. If we do nothing, the artillery will shred our dummies. German analysts will study the crater patterns, the debris field. They will see no shrapnel scarring on steel, no hydraulic fluid fires. They will see splinters of pine and torn canvas. The entire operation, the deaths last night, it all becomes a pathetic joke. The panzer divisions they pulled from the front will be sent back. Our real offensive will hit a reinforced line. The losses will be in the tens of thousands. Your battalion captain will be sent into that meat grinder anyway. This way, their sacrifice has a purpose. It buys a victory. The logic was monstrous. It was also irrefutable. It was the cold calculus of Volkov's office brought to its ghastly logical conclusion. They had to feed the ghost real blood to make its shadow seem solid. Krylov spoke, his voice a dry rasp. The placement. It must be precise. The real tanks must be positioned exactly among the dummies. The explosion patterns. The fire must look authentic. It must tell the right story. He was already thinking like a director staging a catastrophe, and the horror of his own detachment made him physically shudder. Volunteers were called for from Yermolov's battalion. It was not a request. It was a death sentence, and every man knew it. Yet men stepped forward, not with fanfare, but with a resigned, terrible clarity. They were tankers. They understood the greater battle. 2 crews were chosen. 2 of the older T-34s, machines already weary from the nightly charade. They were loaded not with live shells for the enemy, but with extra drums of diesel fuel and small prepared charges of low-grade explosives, enough to create a spectacular, oily fireball, but not so much as to seem like a massive ammo depot detonation. As the first hint of light bleached the eastern horizon, the 2 real tanks rumbled slowly, solemnly, into their predetermined positions among the silent ranks of dummies. They looked like brothers joining a frozen, ghostly family. Their crews disembarked, saluting their machines for the last time. Their faces were masks of stoic misery. They were led away to the safety of the bunkers, leaving their steel coffins behind. Everything was ready. The remaining dummies stood sentinel. The 2 real tanks sat among them, loaded with their own funeral pyres. Semyonov, Yermolov, and Krylov watched from the primary observation post, a kilometer away, their binoculars trained on the target sector. The air was cold and still. The world held its breath. The first shell was a sound before it was a sight, a distant, faint shriek that grew into a tearing of the sky. Then impact. A geyser of black earth and smoke erupted not 50 meters from the first dummy. The ground shook. Then another, and another. The German battery was walking its fire in with methodical, devastating precision. Then, a direct hit. A flash, not just of impact, but of a violent, orange-yellow eruption. One of the real T-34s vanished in a rolling fireball that climbed into the morning sky. A dark, oily pillar of grief. Secondary explosions, the prepared charges and fuel, crackled within the inferno, sending pieces of real metal spinning through the air, tearing through nearby canvas dummies with brutal authenticity. It was a perfect, horrifying simulation of a direct hit on an armored vehicle. Another shell landed close to the second real tank. It did not explode with the same catastrophic fury, but it ruptured its fuel cells. A river of fire poured out, engulfing the lower hull, then climbing, a hungry living thing, swallowing the machine in a slower, more agonizing burn. The smoke was different now, thick, black, acrid, with the smell of burning rubber, paint, and real, precious metal. From the German observation posts, the view through their scopes was everything von Bruck needed to see. The convincing initial explosions, the satisfying secondary detonations, the distinct patterns of an armored vehicle burning fiercely. They had drawn blood. They had hit the heart of something real. In the Soviet bunker, Yermolov watched the life's work of his battalion, the machines he had nursed, commanded, and driven through the absurd nightly ballets, turn into tombs for their own crews' pretended deaths. He did not cry.
He stood perfectly still, but his hand, gripping the edge of the viewing slit, trembled with a vibration that seemed to come from the core of the earth. A single hot tear of pure rage tracked through the grime on his cheek. He did not wipe it away. Krylov watched his creation being torn apart, but his artist's eye noted with a detachment that sickened him how right the real fires looked amidst his fake ones. The contrast sold the lie. The sacrifice was working. Semyonov lowered his binoculars. The smoke column rose, a dark, twisting monument to their successful deception. They had passed the test. They had convinced the enemy of their reality by giving them something genuine to destroy. But the cost was a poison in his soul. He had not just gambled with lives. He had orchestrated a ritual destruction of his own side's strength to appease the illusion. The Ghost Army had demanded and received its pound of flesh. And it was not satisfied. It hungered for more. The silence after the bombardment was not the silence of a stage set, but the roaring, deafening silence of a debt that could never be repaid, a victory that felt indistinguishable from damnation. The line between deception and betrayal had been erased in the fire. The pillar of smoke over the false army hung in the still summer air for hours, a dark, grim exclamation point declaring a truth that was a lie. In the Soviet observation post, the mood was funereal, the acrid smell of distant burning metal and paint carried on the wind, a sensory confirmation of their macabre success. Yermolov stood apart, his back to the others, shoulders rigid. He was not mourning men, but machines that had been comrades in their own way, sacrificed not to enemy action in battle, but to a general's cynical calculation. The two burned-out hulks, now cooling among the shattered dummies, were the most convincing pieces of evidence they had ever placed. The ghost had been given a real, smoldering heart.
In the German headquarters, Oberst von Bruck studied the latest aerial photographs, delivered by a courier plane still warm from its flight. The images were stark. The cratered field, the unmistakable twisted carcasses of at least 2 verifiable tanks, the blast patterns, the scattering of heavy real debris, were textbook. Around them, other shapes were mangled, obscured by smoke and shadow. But the central fact was undeniable. They had struck a meaningful target. His earlier artistic suspicions were drowned out by the hard, physical evidence of destruction. No commander would sacrifice real, frontline tanks to protect a deception. The logic was impeccable. The silence of his Brandenburg team now had a grim explanation. They had stumbled upon a heavily guarded, genuine staging area and been eliminated. Von Bruck smoothed the photograph with a pale hand. His doubt, that nagging sense of a stage too perfectly set, evaporated. He had been wrong. This was not a carefully painted backdrop. It was a real threat, and it had just been bloodied. He drafted his assessment with swift, decisive strokes. The intelligence pointed to a concentrated Soviet armored reserve, likely the vanguard of a planned flanking maneuver, now wounded but still potent. Its presence demanded a counterweight, a shift in the German order of battle. The machinery of the Wehrmacht, ponderous but precise, began to turn. Orders, encrypted and urgent, traveled down the chain. In a wooded area 60 kilometers to the south, the men of the elite Grossdeutschland Panzer Grenadier Division received the confusing, unwelcome command to disengage from their reserve position. Their heavy Tiger tanks, their grenadiers, their artillery, all were to move north, toward a quiet sector that had suddenly become a priority. Simultaneously, elements of the 7th Panzer Division received similar orders. 2 battle-hardened formations, swords meant for the main Soviet thrust, were being sheathed and redirected toward a phantom. For Semyonov and his exhausted band, the shift was invisible, but palpable. The tension did not lessen, but its character changed. The waiting was no longer passive. It became an active, desperate vigil for a sign that their sacrifice had purchased anything more than 2 ruined tanks. Semyonov pushed the radio detachment to new levels of subtlety. The transmissions now carried a new subtext: controlled panic, damage assessment, urgent but garbled requests for repair parts and fuel, the sounds of a real formation licking its wounds and struggling to regain readiness. He ordered the creation of dummy repair vehicles, cranes and trucks fashioned from logs and canvas, to be positioned near the burned wrecks, selling the narrative of recovery. Then, on the 3rd day after the artillery strike, the confirmation came. It did not arrive in a triumphant communiqué from Moscow. It came through the dirt, through the air, through the changed rhythm of the war itself. First, the partisan network reported unusual German motorized column movement on the northern roads, heading away from the main Kursk Bulge. Then, Soviet aerial reconnaissance, risked over the secondary sector, brought back grainy but clear images. Long, unmistakable columns of German armor, the distinctive boxy shapes of half-tracks, the menacing profiles of Panzer IVs, and the rare, hulking silhouette of a tiger, snaking along dust-choked roads that led directly toward their position, and then past it, to defensive grids established 10 kilometers behind the Phantom Army's location. The enemy was not attacking the Ghost. They were fortifying against it. They were taking up defensive positions to contain the threat they believed was there. Finally, the ultimate validation came from the skies. The deep, thunderous drone of massed German Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers echoed from the west. But the sound did not peak overhead. It passed to the north, focused on the real Soviet front lines, the main point of contact. And for the first time in weeks, that distant thunder was not supported by the shrieking whine of tanks in immediate counterattack. The German panzer reserves, the critical hammer meant to smash Soviet breakthroughs, were silent. They were not there. They were here, in the woods, facing a field of painted canvas and two scorched hulls. In the command dugout, a young signals lieutenant handed Semyonov the decoded message from front headquarters. It was brief, dry, and seismic. Operation 10, confirmed effective. Enemy Strategic Reserves GD and 7th PAS identified diverting to your sector. Main offensive proceeds as planned. Hold position and maintain illusion until further notice. Well done. Semyonov read the words once, then again. He felt no surge of triumph, no elation. Instead, a profound, hollow exhaustion settled into his bones. He looked across the dugout at Krylov, who was staring at him, a question etched in the deep lines of his face. Semyonov gave a single, slow, almost imperceptible nod. Krylov understood. He did not cheer. He simply closed his eyes, his body slumping in his chair as if the strings holding him up had been cut. The immense, crushing weight of responsibility, the weight of the entire lie, lifted, and in its place rushed a void, a numbness. They had done it. They had fooled the wolf into guarding an empty sheepfold. Yermolov received the news in silence. He walked out of the bunker, into the fading light. He looked toward the field where his tanks had burned. The smoke was long gone. The victory felt like ash in his mouth. His command was decimated, not by the enemy they were trained to fight, but by the war they had been forced to wage, a war of perception, of sacrifice without honor, of winning by becoming less real. That night, there were no orchestrated tank maneuvers. The Ghost Army had served its purpose. It could rest. The only sounds were the natural ones, the wind through the birch leaves, the distant, ever-present grumble of the real war to the north, now raging with a renewed fury as Soviet forces met weakened resistance. The main offensive was underway. The path had been cleared by an army that never was. Semyonov stood at his observation post, looking at the dark shapes of his dummies under the starlight. They had won. They had shifted the course of steel and blood with wood and paint and two real burning torches. He had saved his life, earned a reprieve from the Lubyanka's shadow, perhaps even an order for his chest. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him deeper than any fear of failure, that he would never be clean of this. The victory was absolute, and it was utterly corrupting. He had not outsmarted the enemy. He had descended into the deepest machinery of deceit and become a part of it. The ghost had not just fooled the Wehrmacht, it had hollowed out the men who gave it life, leaving them standing in a field of their own magnificent, terrible lie, wondering if anything, including their own triumph, was real anymore. The duel was over. The illusion had prevailed, and in its victory, it had consumed everything it touched. The silence that followed the confirmation of their success was the most profound yet. It was not the tense quiet of waiting, nor the breathless hush before execution. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a stage after the final curtain has fallen, the audience gone, leaving only the discarded props under the harsh worklights. The war had moved on. The distant thunder from the north solidified into a continuous, grinding roar.
the sound of the real Soviet offensive meeting, and now overpowering, a German defense stripped of its vital reserves. Every distant explosion was a testament to the Ghost Army's effectiveness, and a nail in the coffin of the men who had given it life. Orders came from high command, crisp and final.
The operation was concluded. The detachment was to dismantle and evacuate with extreme prejudice. They were to leave nothing of value, not a single clue to the scale or nature of the deception. The materials were to be burned, the tools scattered, the earth scarred to suggest a hurried departure of a real force. And then they were to disappear, as if they themselves had been phantoms. The dismantling was a grim, joyless mirror of the construction. There was no care now, only a brutal efficiency. The beautiful, intricate dummies, Krylov's masterpieces of perspective and shadow, were not carefully taken apart. They were torn down. Canvases were slashed with knives, wooden frames splintered by sledgehammers. The men worked with a sullen, furious energy, taking out their accumulated fear, their survivor's guilt, their sense of profound dislocation on the very creations that had saved them. It was an act of violent catharsis. The field that had held such menacing potential became a junkyard of broken illusions. The two burned-out T-34s posed a problem. They were real, heavy, impossible to move. Semyonov gave the order. Using the last of the explosives, his sappers rigged the hulls for demolition. The charges were not to hide their nature, but to obliterate it. In two sharp, concussive booms that echoed flatly across the empty landscape, the real tanks were turned into unrecognizable scrap, their forms mangled into something that could have been anything: a supply truck, a command vehicle, another dummy. The final pieces of genuine evidence were erased, completing the circle of the lie. Krylov oversaw the burning of the leftover materials. He stood, motionless, as the pyres of pine, canvas, and paint were lit. The flames, orange and hungry, consumed months of work in minutes. They did not crackle merrily. They roared, a funeral dirge for an army that had never lived.
The smoke was different from the oily black pillar of the sacrificial tanks. It was lighter, grayer, carrying the scent of a theater fire. He did not sketch this. He simply watched, his face blank, the creative fire in his eyes extinguished, leaving behind only ash. His masterpiece was being incinerated, and with it, the last of his belief in the power of creation. He had used his art to manipulate reality, and now reality was reclaiming its tools with fire. Captain Yermolov gathered his remaining 8 tanks and their hollow-eyed crews. They were a battered, depleted battalion, their machines weary from endless nights of pointless maneuvering, their spirit broken by the calculated loss of their brothers in arms. They formed up not for battle, but for a retreat. As they rumbled slowly away from the field, Yermolov did not look back at the smoldering piles. He looked ahead, toward the sound of the real war. His face was set in stone, a young man aged a decade in weeks. He was returning to combat, but he would never again see war as a contest of strength and will. It was a game of lies, and he had learned that the most effective lies cost real blood. His battalion was no longer a weapon. It was a surviving artifact of a deeper, more sinister conflict. Finally, it was time for Semyonov to leave. He walked alone across the ravaged field. The ground was a chaotic tapestry of tire tracks, footprints, shell craters from the German strike, and the blackened scars of the pyres. It told a furious, contradictory story of an army that had been here, a story he had authored. He stopped at the edge of the largest crater, near the twisted cooling metal that had been a T-34. This was the altar of their success. From his tunic pocket, he took not a medal, but the simple battered TT pistol General Volkov had slid across the desk a lifetime ago. He had never returned it. It was the cold weight that had anchored him to his own mortality through every step of the madness. He held it in his palm, feeling its lethal balance. It was the only truly real thing left. The promise of a clean end had been the seed of this entire, grotesque victory. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and threw the pistol into the deepest part of the crater. It landed with a soft thud in the dirt. He followed it with the single spare magazine. Let the earth have it. Let the truth of that choice be buried here, with the ghost. He turned and walked to the waiting jeep without a backward glance. Krylov was already inside, a shrunken figure wrapped in a greatcoat too large for him, staring at nothing. The convoy moved out, a handful of trucks in the jeep, kicking up dust on the dirt road. They passed a signpost at the edge of the sector. Someone, one of the carpenters perhaps as a final, bitter joke, had nailed a rough piece of plywood to it. On it, in hastily painted Cyrillic letters, was a message not for them, but for the next occupiers, for the German scouts who would inevitably creep into this abandoned place. Thank you for your attention. Next performance, hell. Semyonov saw it, and for the first and only time, a grim, mirthless smile touched his lips. It was the perfect epitaph. The jeep crested a hill, and the field vanished from view, swallowed by the rolling landscape. Ahead, the horizon was lit, not by the false fires of their creation, but by the constant, flickering glow of the real battle, the colossal engagement at Kursk, whose tide had been turned by an army of shadows. Semyonov did not feel like a hero returning from a mission. He felt like a stagehand who had escaped the burning theater, his hands stained with soot and something no water could cleanse. He had traded a bullet for a medal, his life for his soul, and a victory for the unsettling knowledge that in the modern war, the most powerful army was not made of steel, but of an idea, meticulously crafted and sold with the currency of real sacrifice. The ghost had been dismantled, but it would never leave him. It would walk beside him, a silent, hollow companion for the rest of his days, a testament to the fact that the greatest deceptions are not those we perpetrate on the enemy, but those we are forced to enact upon ourselves. The duel was over. The illusion had won, and the victors drove away in silence, haunted by the emptiness of their own perfect, terrible creation.